This is Mountaintop History, a podcast dedicated to telling the story of Monticello and all who lived and labored at this plantation. I'm Kyle Chattleton, and today we're discussing the story of Edith Fossett, an enslaved chef at Monticello, and her family. The story of the Fossett family, like so many other enslaved families throughout the United States, is marked by oppression and violence, yet also resilience, tradition, and community. I spoke with Alice Wagner of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation about Edith Fossett and her family. We chatted amongst the recreated vegetable garden at Monticello, where our conversation naturally began with food. So right now we're out in the vegetable garden. You know, I just like to think about all of the delicious food that was clearly served here at Monticello and elsewhere, of course, wherever Jefferson was. All of it really made for delicious eating here at Monticello.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of the things we think about as kind of being like classic American foods, like mac and cheese and French fries and, vanilla ice cream. Falling in love with those dishes and bringing them here. And we can see why we love those dishes too.
Yeah, and actually, last night, I kind of in prep for our conversation today, we have a number of these Monticello recipes kind of on paper, and so we can actually recreate them. And last night, I tried to make the mac and cheese. I don't think I was entirely successful, but it does seem like, with these recipes, it's delicious, maybe not so healthy.
yeah, for sure. Lots of butter,
Like even when cooking the pasta, I guess the recipe stipulates that you need to also be boiling the pasta in milk. So you're already like trying to get all this kind of dairy on the pasta, and then you throw it in a casserole dish and then just layer it with butter and cheese and butter and cheese and butter and cheese. It sounds delicious, but again,
when COVID's over, I want you to invite me over for this mac and cheese dinner.
well, hopefully by then I'll actually do a better job with the recipe. But yeah, let's talk about who is the person who is cooking the food here at Monticello. Who's the main chef?
Yeah, so we're looking at Jefferson's retirement years here because, of course, he lives at Monticello on this land for his whole life. So there are several different enslaved cooks throughout Jefferson's lifetime. But in the retirement years, the head enslaved chef was a woman named Edith Fossett. And Edith Fossett was a young woman, only about 15 years old, when Thomas Jefferson brought her to the White House to be trained by a French chef there. So she was learning, this French cuisine. But no doubt she probably, already knew how to cook a little bit, at least probably from, as many of us do, we learn from our parents how to cook our first dishes. So she certainly probably had already learned some of that. So she's kind of mixing in her, family traditions and this French cuisine and creating what we think of as typical Southern cuisine now, brings in a lot of African influences, things like okra, and sesame, mixing them with New World things like chilies and potatoes. Then you got the Old World things like greens and lots of butter. I mean, that's coming from the French cooking, So kind of creating a new cuisine. And she's certainly not the only person doing this. This is something you see all throughout the South, that these enslaved cooks are really making a new American cuisine out of these different traditions.
We're here in the vegetable garden, and as we kind of look up towards the rest of the mountaintop, we can of course see the dome, but also we're looking at some of the rooms along the south wing of the house. We can see the kitchen, again, where Edith Fossett is kind of leading the cooking here at Monticello. The food is going to be coming out of the kitchen, making its way down the cellar, and then eventually up into the dining room. But also right next to the kitchen is the cook's room, where Edith Fossett and the rest of her family live. Can you tell us a little bit about their family?
Yeah, so Edith Fossett married a man named Joseph Fossett, and her maiden name, by the way, was Hern. So she was Edith Hern Fossett, and her husband, Joseph, was a blacksmith here at Monticello. So he would have started work in the nailery as a young man, probably only 10, 11 years old. That's kind of how the division of labor often worked, is that the young boys, 10 or 11, would start in the nailery. Young women often started in the weaver's cottage, which is not too far from us here at the kitchens either. And Joseph Fossett is a nephew, by the way, of Sally Hemings, a name I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with. So he is part of the larger Hemings family here at Monticello.
Edith and Joseph Fossett were a married couple, but they spent time apart from one another, with Edith cooking for Thomas Jefferson in Washington, D.C., and Joseph back at the Monticello plantation in Central Virginia.
They're a young married couple, but they are, being forced to be separate from one another. They're having no direct communication with one another. It's kind of a word of mouth situation going on. Just the way that slavery forces separation on people quite a lot, and strains these family bonds, these romantic bonds, friendship bonds that people have with one another.
And that's what ultimately happens with the Fossett family, right? We know that when Thomas Jefferson passes away, he only frees so many individuals in his will. One of them is Joseph Fossett, but the rest of Joseph Fossett's family are not freed in the will. And so we get a sense, right, that this family is it's a trying time for them, in particular the auction sale that takes place here at Monticello and in Charlottesville.
Yeah, so by this point, Edith and Joseph Fossett have had 8 children. And so Joseph Fossett's a free man. He's standing on that famous west lawn of Monticello, probably. That's where the auction was held, watching as his wife and his children are being sold to different plantations. But Edith Fossett's not just there with her children being sold. She's there with her siblings, that she and her siblings were born here at Monticello, grew up here. And so she's not only experiencing the separation from her husband, but experiencing separation from brothers and sisters, many of whom, we don't have necessarily record if they ever saw each other again. Just knowing that she's standing on this auction block and all these people she loves, she may not ever get to see them again, doesn't know exactly what might be happening.
It's a moment of real uncertainty for everyone.
Yeah. And it's a moment of realization, actually, for one of the Fossett children, Peter Fossett, one of their sons. It's that moment on the auction block that he realizes what's happening to him. He's 11 years old, and he's being sold away from his mother and his brothers and his sisters, his father. So yeah, it's definitely this moment of heartbreak, anger, I'm sure, terror for many people. And this is kind of the emotional violence of slavery that a lot of times we, in America, when we talk about slavery, when we think about the violence of it, we're often thinking beatings and whippings, which were certainly things that happened here at Monticello as well. But there's also this emotional violence that happens that at any moment, based on somebody else's whims, that a person can lose their loved ones.
The story of the Fossett family, like so many other enslaved families, was also one of resilience. That in spite of the oppression and violence they faced in their everyday lives, they resisted slavery in different ways.
But Joseph Fossett, he's not going to just, let that stand. So he, as we mentioned earlier, was freed by Thomas Jefferson in Jefferson's will. He's still working as a blacksmith, and he's going to reach out to the Black community for help. It's important to note that not every Black person in Charlottesville was an enslaved person. It was a free Black community here as well. And so they had tight community bonds of their own. This is going to include some of Joseph Fossett's siblings. So Joseph Fossett, his mother, Mary Hemings, was Sally Hemings' older sister. She is going to be purchased by a Mr. Bell. So he was, like Jefferson, a free white slaveholder, purchases Mary Hemings, and they end up living in a common law marriage. So they were not legally allowed to marry. In Virginia at that time, there were laws banning interracial marriages, laws which I should point out remain on the books until 1967 with the famous Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court case. So he's not legally allowed to marry her, but in all other respects, she's his wife. So Joseph Fossett has these half-siblings who, are being born and raised in a very different environment. And so he reaches out to them for help saving his wife and his children. One of his sisters married a free black man named Jesse Scott. And Jesse Scott, with help from Mary Hemings Bell, is going to purchase Edith and the two youngest sons. So they're going to purchase them in order to make sure that somebody else doesn't get a hold of them, maybe sell them further south until Joseph can save up all the money to save all of his family. They don't have all the money to purchase all of the children, so some of his other brothers or some of his other children end up on other plantations. And so you can imagine, not just for him, but what that would be like for Edith Fossett. That she's able to make sure that her two youngest are with her, but there's probably always this worry about the other children, the ones that she doesn't have with her, that, doesn't have in her line of sight, doesn't know, what their slaveholders might do with them. And in fact, Peter Fossett, the one I mentioned earlier, his slaveholder refuses to sell him to his father. And so Peter Fossett resolves that he is going to get free or die trying. He continues to learn how to read and write, despite prohibitions from his new slaveholder. He escapes from that plantation 2 different times. He's caught both times, but after that second time, the slaveholder decides that he is too much trouble and he's going to put him up on the auction block. Fortunately, some friends of the family got word of this and were able to purchase Peter. And he was able to reunite with his family, who had now moved to Ohio. However, this doesn't happen until Peter is 35 years old. So he's 11 when he's sold away from his family, 35 by the time he is able to reunite with them.
So, Alice, one of the things we talk about a lot here at Monticello is ways in which the enslaved community resisted the situation they all found themselves in. And of course, Joseph Fossett, his friends, his family, his wife, their immediate family, all their actions, of course, are a part of this resistance. But also, even when we started our whole conversation about food, all the delicious meals that Edith Fossett is making, all of these are, in a way, these folks basically claiming their humanity, right?
Yeah.
Like the food is handing down of traditions. It's being able to preserve culture and create new forms of culture. An example of the many ways in which folks resisted against the inhumanity that was forced upon them through slavery.
Yeah, community, I think, is so important to this aspect of it. I actually just gave a tour to some, virtually, to some 4th graders from Richmond. And, one of them said, well, we're black people helping other black people. No such a succinct way to put it. Yeah, absolutely they were. But, so these community bonds that people develop, not just within the Monticello community, but with other places. These bonds of community are an incredibly important way that enslaved people are resisting the system of slavery.
This has been another episode of Mountaintop History, a collaboration podcast between WTJU and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation.
This episode of Mountaintop History was made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Join us for new episodes every 2 weeks on Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and the Virginia Audio Collective.
To learn more about Monticello or to plan your next trip, visit us online at monticello.org.